The HOA demolished my lake cabin for failing to pay fees that didn't even exist. I came home to find 30 years of my life reduced to a pile of splinters. The cabin I built for my late wife was gone, and so was her wedding ring inside. The HOA president thought she was making an example of me. She thought she had all the power, but she made one critical mistake. She had no idea that, while she was bulldozing my small piece of heaven, she was messing with the one man who secretly owned the entire neighborhood. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, because this revenge plan is about to get nuclear. And if you believe every HOA Karen needs to be put in their place, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment they get what they deserve. The first thing I saw was the tail end of a flatbed truck pulling away, slow and heavy like a hearse. It was kicking up dust on the gravel road that led from my cabin. Something was chained down on the back, a mangled mess of timber, splintered 2x4s, and the green tin roof I'd put on with my own 2 hands, now crumpled like a forgotten candy wrapper. It took my brain a solid 10 seconds to catch up with my eyes. That wasn't just scrap wood. That was my cabin, or what was left of it. The truck turned onto the main road and was gone, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of dust and a gaping hole in the landscape where 30 years of my life used to be. I stood there, engine off, keys still in my hand, and just stared. The air smelled of sawdust and diesel. There was no warning, no notice, no final call, just gone. The cabin was the one place on earth that still felt like it belonged to Sarah. We'd bought the little half-acre plot by the lake back when we were still kids, saving every spare dollar I made from side jobs. I was a Navy engineer, good with blueprints and stress calculations, but Sarah was the architect of that place. She'd drawn the layout on a napkin one night, deciding exactly where the big picture window would go to catch the morning sun over the water. "So we can have coffee and watch the loons," she'd said. I built it myself. Every beam, every board, every nail. I remembered her standing on the half-finished porch, holding a hammer like it was a foreign object, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a smile that could power a city. She'd hammered in one nail, bent it completely sideways, and we'd laughed so hard I almost fell off the ladder. We left that bent nail in the porch post. It was our cornerstone, our funny little secret. After she was gone, the cabin was more than a retreat. It was a memory I could walk into. I'd bring the grandkids out there, show them how to skip stones, tell them stories about their grandmother. It was where her photo albums were, where I kept the little rocking chair I'd made for our firstborn, and in the top drawer of the nightstand, where it was always safe, I kept her wedding ring. The trouble started 6 weeks earlier. A crisp woman named Meryl Cartwright showed up at my door. She was in her early 60s, wearing beige slacks so starched they could have stood up on their own, and holding a clipboard like it was a scepter. She introduced herself as the new HOA board president. I just nodded. I knew about the Lakeview Meadows Homeowners Association next door, but my plot was never part of it. The original developer, a guy named Henderson I'd shaken hands with 30 years ago, had made that clear. My title was clear. The county plat map was clear. My little piece of heaven was carved out long before their little kingdom of beige houses was ever built. Meryl Cartwright didn't seem to care about any of that. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and told me the board was auditing all properties under our jurisdiction. 2 days later, the first notice was taped to my door. A violation for unapproved siding color. My cabin was stained cedar, same as it had been since 1993. A week later, another one. Improper lawn maintenance. I didn't have a lawn. I had a shoreline with pine trees. I called the number on the notice. Meryl answered on the first ring. I tried to explain, calmly, that there was a mistake. "Mr. Hayden," she said, her voice dripping with fake patience, "our records clearly show your parcel, Lot 47B, is part of the Lakeview Meadows Covenant, and you're severely delinquent on your dues." I told her that was impossible. I didn't have a lot number. I had a land description from the county registrar. I didn't owe any dues, because I had never been part of her association. There was a pause. I could hear papers shuffling. Well, that's not what my paperwork says. Our files show an unpaid balance of $4,700, plus late fees. I suggest you get that paid promptly to avoid further enforcement action. And she hung up. I wasn't worried, not really. Annoyed, sure. You don't spend 25 years as a Navy engineer without learning how to trust documents. I went to my safe deposit box and pulled out the original deed. I drove to the county courthouse and got a fresh copy of the official plat map. There it was, in crisp black ink, a thick, solid line, separating my property from the sprawling grid of Lakeview Meadows. My land was its own thing, an island of common sense in a sea of regulations. I even called my old Navy buddy, Ray Delgado, who'd gone on to be a lawyer. He laughed when I told him. "Jack, don't waste your breath," he said. "She's got nothing. A title is a title. A plat map is a plat map. She can send you all the angry letters she wants, but she can't touch your land." I decided to try one more time. I went to their monthly HOA meeting, held in a stuffy community center that smelled like floor wax and stale coffee. I brought my file, the deed, the map, the original purchase agreement. I waited until the public comment period, stood up, and laid it all out. I wasn't angry. I was direct. I spoke clearly, like I was briefing an admiral. "There's been a mistake," I said, pointing to the line on the map. "My property is not, and has never been, part of this HOA. Here are the county records to prove it." Merrill Cartwright sat at the head of the table, not even looking at my documents. She just smiled that same cold smile. "Thank you for your comment, Mr. Hayden," she said, her voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "The board has its own set of records, which were properly filed and ratified. They tell a very different story." Someone in the back snickered. She shuffled some papers in a folder in front of her, papers I couldn't see, and then looked right at me. "We consider this matter closed." It felt like a trap. Her confidence was absolute. It was the confidence of someone who either had an ace up her sleeve or was just plain crazy. I left that meeting feeling a cold knot in my stomach. It wasn't about the money. It was about the lie. It was about a stranger trying to rewrite the history of the one place my wife had loved most. And now, standing here, looking at the fresh tire tracks in the dirt where my cabin used to stand, I realized Ray was wrong. She hadn't just touched my land. She had scorched it. I walked out of that community center with my head held high, my file of proof tucked under my arm. Merrill Cartwright could have her little smirk and her mystery paperwork. It didn't matter. The law was the law, and the facts were on my side. Ray confirmed it again that night over the phone. "Jack, what she's doing is called slander of title," he said, his voice as calm as a flat sea. "It's illegal. She's knowingly making false claims about your property. And without a single certified notice of violation sent to your legal address, she has zero enforcement power. Zilch. Let her play her games. If she so much as tries to file a lien, we'll have her in court so fast her head will spin." That was all I needed to hear. Hope wasn't just a glimmer. It was a searchlight. I had the county records. I had 30 years of tax bills proving I paid the county directly, not some neighborhood association. I had a clear title. I had a good lawyer. I figured I'd let Merrill stew in her own self-importance for a few days before Ray sent the official cease and desist letter. She wanted to make a fool of me in public, but in the end, the paperwork would do the talking. I felt calm, in control. That Friday, I picked up my grandson Leo from his mom's house. He's 9 years old, all knobby knees and endless questions. We had our annual fall fishing trip planned. We packed up the cooler with sandwiches and juice boxes, grabbed our rods, and headed 2 hours north to a state park, far away from any neighborhood with rules about the color of your siding. For 2 days, there was no HOA. There was just the smell of pine needles, the gentle slap of water against the boat, and Leo's excited shouts every time he got a nibble. We talked about school, about his favorite video games, and about his grandmother, Sarah. I told him how she used to pretend she was a terrible fisherman, only to pull in the biggest catch of the day right at the end. It was good. It was simple. It was the kind of weekend the cabin was built for. I didn't think about Merrill Cartwright once. Why would I? I had the truth on my side. We got back Sunday evening, just after sunset. I turned onto my little gravel road, and Leo was asleep in the passenger seat. I was thinking about getting him inside and into bed before his mom came to pick him up, but as my headlights swept across the clearing, my truck slowed to a stop on its own. The world just went silent. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. There was nothing there, just a raw, ugly patch of dirt and shattered wood where the cabin should have been. The foundation was a mess of crushed concrete blocks. The big pine tree we'd hung a swing on was scarred and splintered, its lower branches snapped off. The ground was chewed up by the tracks of heavy machinery. I got out of the truck, leaving the door open and the engine running. I walked toward the rubble in a daze. My first thought was fire, or a tornado. But there was no smell of smoke. No other trees were down. There was only the sickening, deliberate carnage. My toolbox, the heavy steel one I'd had since my first day in the Navy, was pried open and empty. My tools, collected over a lifetime, were gone. I sifted through the wreckage. I found a piece of a blue and white plate Sarah had bought at a flea market. I found the blackened remains of a photo album. The edges of the pictures curled into ash. And then the cold dread hit me so hard, my knees almost buckled. The nightstand. I scrambled over a pile of broken drywall and splintered 2x4s to where the bedroom used to be. I dug through the debris with my bare hands until my fingers were raw, looking for any piece of that little wooden drawer. Nothing. It was all just splinters and dust. Sarah's wedding ring was gone. The simple gold band I'd put on her finger 42 years ago. The one thing I had left of hers that I could still hold in my hand. Gone. Vanished into the greed and spite of a bulldozer's scoop. That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some bureaucratic mix-up. This was targeted. Merrill Cartwright knew I'd be away. She knew she didn't have the legal right. So she'd held some sham emergency vote, probably with her 2 cronies on the board, and pushed it through before I could stop her. She hadn't sent a certified letter, because she knew it would give me time to react. She hadn't filed a lien, because she knew it would be thrown out of court. She'd skipped the law entirely and went straight for the jugular. She didn't just want to prove a point about her fake power. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to crush the one thing I couldn't replace. She wanted to make an example of the guy who stood up to her in public, to show every other resident in Lakeview Meadows what happens when you question the Queen. My neighbors, the ones in the HOA, were peeking through their blinds. I saw the curtains twitch. No one came out. No one called. They were afraid. I couldn't blame them. That was the whole point of this exercise in terror. But I didn't feel rage. Not the hot, shouting kind anyway. What I felt was colder, heavier. It was the feeling an engineer gets when a critical system fails, and you have to strip it down to the studs to find out why. I stood there for a long time, the car headlights cutting through the dusk, illuminating the tombstone of my life. Then, I walked back to my truck, shut off the engine, and pulled a yellow legal pad and a tape measure from the passenger side floor. Leo was still asleep, oblivious. I walked back to the wreckage, clicked the end of the tape measure, and began to pace out the dimensions of the property line. First east to west, then north to south. I made notes. I sketched diagrams. I measured the distance to the road, to the water, to the nearest utility pole. The anger was still there, a solid lump of iron in my gut, but my hands were steady. My mind was clear. Merrill Cartwright and her little board of tyrants thought they had erased me. They thought they had won. Standing there in the ruins, with the dust of my memories clinging to my clothes, I made a silent promise to myself, to my wife, to that place. They hadn't erased me. They had just given me a reason to start building something new. And it wasn't going to be a cabin. It was going to be a reckoning. A week after the demolition, another notice was taped to the splintered remains of my front gatepost. It was from the Lakeview Meadows HOA, of course. A fine. $200 for unauthorized debris accumulation. They had the nerve to bulldoze my cabin and then fine me for the mess they made. It was so ridiculous it was almost funny. But I wasn't laughing. It was a message. A flexing of muscle. Merrill Cartwright was telling me, and anyone else who might be watching, that she was still in charge. The message was received. My nearest neighbors, the Carters, used to wave every time I drove by. Now, Ethan would see my truck coming and suddenly find something fascinating to look at in his garage. His wife would pull the kids inside. People who used to stop and chat when I was out checking the shoreline now hurried past with their heads down. Merrill hadn't just destroyed my cabin. She had poisoned the well. She'd made an example of me, and fear was a powerful tool for keeping people in line. I didn't blame them. They had homes and families to protect. I just had a pile of rubble and a purpose. I didn't bother responding to the notice. Instead, I started spending my days at the county records office. It's a quiet, dusty place in the basement of the courthouse that smells like old paper and forgotten history. Most people hate places like this. To me, it felt like coming home. In the Navy, I'd spent countless hours in archives, poring over technical manuals and ship blueprints, looking for a single detail that could solve a complex engineering problem. This was no different. Merrill had paperwork. I needed to see it. I needed to understand the machine she had built so I could figure out how to take it apart. I started with my own plot, going back to the original land grant from the 1800s. I followed every sale, every survey, every easement filed against it. It was clean, rock solid. My little piece of dirt was legally separate. Ray was right. So, if my paperwork was correct, hers had to be wrong. The question was, how? I broadened my search. I stopped looking at just my land and started pulling the files for the entire Lakeview Meadows development. I spent days scrolling through microfiche, my eyes burning from the dim green light. I unrolled huge, brittle plat maps that crackled when you touched them. I traced the history of every single lot. It was tedious, painstaking work. But a good engineer is patient. You don't get frustrated. You get methodical. And on the fourth day, I found it. It was buried in a thick binder from 12 years ago. A document titled Covenant Annexation Amendment 2B. It was the HOA's attempt to expand its boundaries to include a dozen or so properties on the outer edge, mine among them. It was a bold move, basically a land grab on paper. But they'd been sloppy. The document required the signatures of 75% of the existing homeowners. They only had 68. It required the amendment to be filed with the county registrar within 90 days of the vote. It was filed on day 91. And the killing blow. The annexation had to be legally recorded on the master plat map. It never was. The line on the official county map, the one I had brought to that meeting, was still the true and legal boundary. Their power over half the properties they claimed to rule was a complete fabrication. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of incompetence and arrogance. A normal person would have taken this information, hired a lawyer, and sued them into the ground. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Suing would take years. Merrill would drown it in appeals and stall tactics. And even if I won, it wouldn't bring back the cabin. It wouldn't restore my neighbor's trust. And it wouldn't fix the rotten system that let a woman like Merrill Cartwright wield this kind of fake power. Justice wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about dismantling the entire throne she sat on. So I kept digging. I started looking for leverage. I searched the online property listings for any lots for sale within the original legally binding borders of Lakeview Meadows. I found 3. One was a small, undeveloped lot from an out-of-state owner who just wanted to get rid of it. Another belonged to an elderly couple moving into a retirement home. The third was a forgotten little parcel listed by a bank. Lot Ione. The number caught my eye. It was the first lot on the original 1986 development plan. I pulled the master covenant from the archives, the founding document for the entire HOA, and there, on page 3, was the detail that changed everything. The developer, Mr. Henderson, had set up the HOA with a failsafe. He'd retained special rights under a developer clause, giving him veto power and the authority to appoint or dismiss the board. Those rights were tied not to him personally, but to the ownership of a specific property, Lot Ione. It was the control lot. As long as he or his company owned it, he ran the show. Henderson had sold off the other lots and dissolved his company years ago, but the bank that ended up with Lot Ione never realized what they had. To them, it was just a quarter-acre of weeds on their books. To me, it was the key to the entire kingdom. I didn't call Ray. I didn't tell a soul. The next morning, I made a cash offer on all 3 lots, slightly above asking price, with a request to close in 5 business days. The bank handling Lot Ione was so thrilled to get an offer, they didn't ask a single question. A week later, the deeds were recorded in my name. I was now a member of the Lakeview Meadows HOA. More than that, I was the legal successor to the original developer. I held the papers that gave me the power to dissolve the very board that had tried to destroy me. Merrill Cartwright was busy sending me another fine, this one with a big red "Final Notice" stamped on it. She was sitting in her little office, moving pawns around on a board she thought she controlled. She had absolutely no idea that I had just bought the whole damn chessboard. The next HOA meeting was a month later. I showed up right on time, wearing a clean work shirt and carrying a large cardboard tube under my arm. The room was half full, mostly with the same regulars who looked either bored or annoyed to be there. Merrill Cartwright sat at the head table, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd been picked for their ability to nod on cue. She saw me walk in, and a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe triumph, crossed her face. I took a seat in the back and waited. They droned on about landscaping budgets and seasonal decorations. When the public comment period came, I was the first one to stand up. Merrill's posture stiffened. "Mr. Hayden," she said, her voice sharp, "I certainly hope you're here to discuss payment arrangements for your outstanding fines. As you know, the board has been more than patient." A few people turned to stare. I just gave a polite nod. "Actually, Madam President," I began, my voice calm and steady, "I'm here because there are some serious discrepancies in the legal documents this board is using to govern. I'd like to formally request copies of the Master Covenant, the current bylaws, and the recorded plat map the board uses for its jurisdiction." Merrill let out a short, dismissive laugh. "All of those documents are available to members in good standing. Since you are delinquent, your request is denied." She picked up her gavel, ready to move on. "Also," I continued, ignoring her, "I'd like to see the minutes from the emergency meeting where the vote was taken to demolish my private property." The room went quiet. You could feel the air change. This wasn't about overgrown lawns anymore. This was about something real. "That was a closed enforcement session," Merrill snapped. "The minutes are not public. And that property is not private. It is under HOA jurisdiction. We've been over this. Now, if you don't have any legitimate business—" "Oh, I think I do," I said, and with that I walked to the front of the room. I laid the cardboard tube on an empty table, uncapped it, and pulled out a full-color, professionally surveyed map. I'd had it printed at an architectural supply shop, 3 feet by 4 feet, big enough for everyone to see. I smoothed it out and tapped a thick red line running down the middle. "This is the official, legally recorded plat map from the Lakeview County Registrar's office," I announced to the room. "And this red line is the legal boundary of the Lakeview Meadows HOA. as established in 1986. Everything on this side, I gestured to the grid of houses, is inside the HOA. Everything on this side, I gestured to the other side, where a large parcel was clearly marked Hayden J., is not. I looked directly at Merrill. As you can see, the HOA's authority ends exactly 212 feet from my former cabin's foundation. You don't manage my land, lady. If anything, I added, letting the words hang in the air, I manage yours. A murmur went through the crowd. People were standing up, leaning forward to get a better look. Merrill's face was turning a blotchy red. For the first time since I'd met her, her mask of cool authority was cracking. That document is a forgery, she hissed, her voice rising. This is a pathetic attempt to avoid your responsibilities. Security! A woman in a cheap-looking polo shirt with a fake badge stitched on it. Someone I'd later learn was Tanya Reynolds, Merrill's personal enforcer, started toward me. I just held my ground. It's not a forgery, ma'am. It's a public record. Anyone can go down to the courthouse and see for themselves. In fact, I encouraged them to. Ethan Carter, my neighbor, was in the third row. I saw him pull out his phone and start taking pictures of the map. He met my eyes for a second and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The tide was starting to turn. Merrill, seeing she was losing control, doubled down. The board's legal counsel will tear this fraudulent map to pieces, she declared. And Mr. Hayden, you can expect a new citation for harassment, and we will be pursuing a restraining order. She was panicking, throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. Over the next week, she did exactly what she'd threatened. I got a nasty letter from the HOA's attorney, a man who clearly hadn't bothered to do his own research. Then came a flood of emails to the entire community, painting me as an unstable, disgruntled troublemaker who was threatening the peace and safety of the neighborhood. The narrative was clear. I was a crazy old man trying to burn the whole place down because I didn't want to pay my bills. What Merrill didn't know was that while she was busy writing her poison pen emails, I was having a quiet lunch with my old friend Ray Delgado. I laid out everything for him: the fake annexation, the illegal demolition, and the ace I had up my sleeve. When I told him about Lot Aoni, a slow grin spread across his face. "Jack," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You magnificent old dog." She picked a fight with a battleship. Ray, being the sharp lawyer he was, didn't waste a second. He spent 2 days drafting the paperwork. We filed a developer reinstatement and a formal notice of board authority transfer with the county. It was a simple, legal process outlined in the original 1986 covenant Merrill had never bothered to read carefully. Effective immediately, the existing HOA board's authority was suspended. They were in limbo, legally powerless, until the developer, me, reconvened a new meeting of owners under the original bylaws. The final step was the public notice. According to the old rules, it had to be posted in a common area for all residents to see. So that evening, I walked over to the community center, the same building where Merrill had tried to humiliate me, and I pinned a single piece of paper to the main bulletin board. It was a clean, professional document, printed on heavy bond paper, with Ray's law firm letterhead at the top. It announced a mandatory special meeting of owners, called for by the current holder of Lot Aon, to be held in 2 weeks' time. The agenda was simple. Item 1. A vote on the dissolution of the current governing board. Item 2. The election of a new board. I stepped back and looked at the notice, hanging right next to a flyer for a community potluck. It was quiet, it was legal, and it was a declaration of war. I was no longer fighting for my little patch of dirt. I was taking the whole hill. The night of the special meeting, the community center was packed. I hadn't seen a turnout like this ever. People were standing in the back, lining the walls. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity and fear. My notice had stirred the pot. For 2 weeks, the neighborhood had been buzzing. Merrill had sent out a series of frantic emails calling my meeting illegal, calling me a fraud, and threatening anyone who attended with fines for participating in an unsanctioned gathering. But her threats had backfired. Instead of scaring people away, she had made them curious. She had made them choose a side. I arrived early with Ray. I wasn't at the head table this time. Merrill and her 2 board members were sitting there, looking rigid and furious. Instead, I set up a small folding table to the side, with a simple microphone and a stack of papers. The meeting started with Merrill banging her gavel. "This is not a legitimate meeting of the Lakeview Meadows HOA," she announced, her voice strained. "Mr. Hayden has no authority here. This gathering is illegal, and your attendance has been noted." She looked out at the crowd, expecting her usual tactics to work, but this time, nobody flinched. From the back of the room, Ethan Carter's voice cut through the silence. "Then why are you here?" A few people chuckled. Merrill's face tightened. That's when I stood up and walked to my little table. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice amplified just enough by the small speaker I'd brought. "Thank you for coming. My name is Jack Hayden. I am the legal owner of Lot Aoni of the Lakeview Meadows development." I paused to let that sink in. Merrill immediately shot back. "Ownership of a single lot is meaningless. This is a fraud." Ray, sitting quietly beside me, just smiled. I ignored her and continued. "According to the founding covenant of this association, a document filed with the county in 1986, the owner of Lot Aoni holds special rights as the successor to the original developer. One of those rights is the power to call a special meeting to address the governance of this community." I held up a certified copy of the covenant, the relevant paragraph highlighted in yellow. "I'm not a lawyer," I said, looking out at my neighbors, "but I've spent the last month reading every page of the documents that are supposed to protect us. It turns out Merrill is right. This isn't a normal HOA meeting. This is an owners' meeting. And tonight, the owners are taking back control." The room erupted. It wasn't a roar. It was a wave of murmurs and whispers. For the first time, people weren't looking at Merrill for direction. They were looking at me. "Before we vote," I said, raising my hand for quiet, "I think it's important for everyone to know who they've been trusting." I then, systematically, calmly, and with documented proof for every claim, laid out Merrill's reign of terror. I presented the official plat map showing the illegal boundary expansion. I presented the evidence that the annexation vote 12 years ago was invalid. I explained that nearly a third of the homes being fined and liened by this board were not, and had never been, legally part of the HOA. With each point, I placed a document on an overhead projector Ray had set up, so the evidence was projected onto the screen behind me, 10 feet high. I told them about my cabin. I told them about the lack of due process, the illegal demolition of private property, and the fines I received for the debris she created. As I spoke, I wasn't angry. I was factual. I was precise. My voice never wavered. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Every eye was on Merrill Cartwright. Her face was ashen. She looked like a cornered animal. She tried to fight back, stammering about her own set of documents and the advice of her attorney, but her voice lacked its usual steel. The foundation of her authority, built on lies and intimidation, had crumbled away in the space of 10 minutes. "Now," I said, turning back to the homeowners, "it's time to clean house. Over the past week, I've spoken with several of your neighbors, people who are tired of the abuse. People who believe an HOA should serve the community, not rule it." One by one, 5 people stood up from their seats in the audience. Ethan Carter was one of them. A retired school teacher, a young mother who ran a home business, a firefighter, and a retired accountant. "These 5 people," I announced, "have agreed to serve as a new interim board of directors. Their first job will be to conduct a full independent audit of the HOA's finances and to correct the illegal boundary lines." "This is a coup," Merrill shrieked, finally finding her voice. "This is mob rule." "No, ma'am," I replied, my voice ringing with clarity. "This is Article 4, Section 2 of the 1986 Covenant." I projected the page onto the screen. It was all there, in black and white. Any holder of lot A own may, by written notice and a majority vote of owners present, reconvene and reconstitute the board of directors. The fight went out of her. She just slumped in her chair, defeated. The final step was the vote. I didn't even have to call for a show of hands. The room rose to its feet in a standing ovation. The applause wasn't for me. It was for themselves. It was the sound of a community taking its power back. Meryl and her two cronies were removed from the board by a unanimous vote. They gathered their things in silence and walked out of the room to a chorus of jeers and catcalls. As she passed me, her eyes were filled with pure venom. "This isn't over," she spat. I knew she was right. Taking away her power was one thing, but that wasn't justice yet. Justice was rebuilding, and making sure she paid for what she'd torn down. Meryl Cartwright wasn't the type to go down quietly. Being publicly humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood didn't chasten her. It just made her meaner. The day after the meeting, she filed a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was a threat to her personal safety. It was a joke, and Ray had it thrown out by lunchtime. But it was a clear signal. This was her new game. If she couldn't win with bylaws, she'd try to win with harassment. She started sending rambling, accusatory emails to the new board members, trying to sow discord. Then she hired a cheap private security company to patrol the road past my property, their cars idling there for hours, a pathetic attempt at intimidation. Tonya Reynolds, her old enforcer, was behind the wheel more often than not, glaring at me from behind her sunglasses. It was annoying, but it was also the desperate thrashing of a drowning woman. Meanwhile, the new board, led by Ethan Carter, was moving with the quiet efficiency of a team that actually wanted to get things done. Their first order of business was the independent audit. They hired a reputable accounting firm from outside the community to go over every invoice, every check, every line of the HOA's books for the past 10 years. Meryl refused to hand over the financial records, claiming they were private property of the former board. She barricaded herself in the small admin building at the entrance to the neighborhood, a little brick shed that served as the HOA's official headquarters, and refused to cooperate. Legally, we could have involved the sheriff and forced her out, but that would have been messy and slow. I had a cleaner, quieter solution. While digging through the county records, I hadn't just focused on property deeds. A good engineer knows that the real power doesn't always lie in who owns the land, but in who controls the pipes and wires running underneath it. I had traced the utility easements for the entire development. It turned out the water, sewer, and power lines serving the common areas, including Merrill's little brick fortress, were owned and managed by a small, independent utility company. The company had been set up by the original developer, Mr. Henderson, and had fallen into obscurity. After he passed, it was sold for a pittance to an investment group that had forgotten it even existed. And it just so happened to be for sale. Dirt cheap. 2 weeks earlier, while Meryl was busy slandering my name, I was quietly becoming the proud owner of the Lakeview Meadows Utility Easement Corporation. The paperwork was finalized the day after she locked herself in the admin building. As the new owner, I reviewed the service contract between my company and the HOA. There was a lovely little clause in there about maintaining a cooperative and functional working relationship. Her refusal to cooperate with the legally constituted new board was a clear breach of that contract. So, I made a phone call. The next morning, a utility truck rolled up to the admin building. A worker got out, opened a service panel by the road, and with a simple flip of a switch, cut the power. An hour later, another worker turned a valve, and the water went off. Meryl could sit in her brick bunker for as long as she wanted, but she was going to be doing it in the dark, without a working toilet. The audit, of course, was a horror show. The accountants found years of doctored minutes, forged lien notices, and checks written to shell companies for landscaping services that never happened. Merrill had been embezzling funds for years, skimming off the top of every contract, padding every invoice. It was a small-time grift, but over a decade, it had added up to tens of thousands of dollars. The demolition of my cabin was the final piece of the puzzle. She had used HOA funds to pay the demolition crew, justifying it with a fraudulent emergency vote. It was more than just a power trip. It was a way to generate a fake invoice and pocket the cash. Word of the fight was starting to spread. A reporter from a local TV station caught wind of the story. Veterans Lake House destroyed by rogue HOA, and showed up with a camera crew. I didn't want the attention, but I knew it was necessary. I stood in front of the wreckage of my cabin and calmly told them everything, backing it up with a stack of documents. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news. By the next morning, Lakeview Meadows was swarming with reporters. Merrill Cartwright was no longer a neighborhood bully. She was a local villain. The public pressure was immense. The county prosecutor's office, which had initially been slow to act, suddenly took a very keen interest in the case. The final act took place at the next official meeting, called by the new board. The community center wasn't just packed, it was overflowing. News cameras lined the back wall. The purpose of the meeting was to present the findings of the audit to the homeowners. Merrill was there. I don't know why she came. Maybe she thought she could somehow talk her way out of it. She sat in the back, pale and silent. Ethan Carter stood at the podium and, with methodical precision, laid out the entire scheme. The embezzlement, the fraudulent votes, the doctored records. Just as he finished, 2 sheriff's deputies walked quietly into the room. They moved down the center aisle, their footsteps the only sound in the dead-silent hall. They stopped right at Merrill's row. One of them leaned down and said something I couldn't hear. Merrill stood up, her face a mask of disbelief. He gently took her arm and placed a pair of handcuffs on her wrists. The click of the cuffs echoed through the room like a gunshot. The cameras started flashing. The crowd erupted. She didn't say a word as they led her out, the final, humiliating chapter of her reign of terror, broadcast live for the entire county to see. The legal battle, in the end, was a whimper, not a bang. Faced with a mountain of evidence from the audit and the very public nature of her arrest, Merrill Cartwright folded. She pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and property destruction. To avoid a longer, more dramatic trial, she was sentenced to 2 years in a state penitentiary, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, and barred for life from ever serving on any board or managing property again. The 2 cronies from her board, facing their own charges, testified against her in exchange for probation. The HOA's lawsuit against me was dropped, and in a separate civil settlement, Merrill's insurance company paid out a substantial sum for the destruction of my cabin. It wasn't enough to replace 30 years of memories, but it was a start. It was a check, written in black ink, that said, "You were right." The real change wasn't in the courtroom, it was back in the neighborhood. With the poison gone, the community started to heal. The new board, led by Ethan, went to work. They held open meetings where people actually talked to each other instead of yelling. They used the recovered funds from the audit to lower the annual dues for everyone. They scaled back the thick rule book, getting rid of the petty, vindictive regulations about lawn ornaments and the precise shade of beige you could paint your mailbox. The atmosphere changed. People started talking to each other over their fences again. Kids started playing in the streets. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of ownership. It was their neighborhood again, not Merrill's kingdom. One of the first things Ethan did, as the new board president, was come to see me. He walked up to the edge of my property, hands in his pockets, and just stood there for a minute, looking at the scarred patch of dirt. "We're so sorry, Jack," he said, and I could hear the honesty in his voice. "We all saw what was happening, and none of us did anything. We were afraid." I told him there was nothing to forgive. Fear makes people do strange things. Then, he handed me a check. It was from the HOA's general fund. The board voted, he said. We want to help you rebuild. Merrill used our money to tear it down. It's only right we use our money to build it back up. I was hesitant at first. I'd always done things on my own. But the next Saturday, I looked out my window and saw a half-dozen cars parked along the road. Ethan was there, along with the firefighter from the new board and a handful of other neighbors. They were carrying tool belts and coolers. Ethan just grinned. Figured you could use some help with the debris cleanup, he said. And just like that, the rebuilding began. It wasn't just me this time, it was a team. We spent weekends clearing the wreckage, pulling out twisted nails and hauling away splintered wood. People I barely knew brought over coffee and sandwiches. Their kids helped rake the dirt smooth. We laid a new foundation, stronger than the first. We framed the walls, and the sound of hammers echoed across the lake, a hopeful, defiant noise. It was more than a construction site. It was a reclamation. We weren't just rebuilding a cabin, we were rebuilding a community, nailing it together with sweat and goodwill. The new cabin looked a lot like the old one. I used the same basic plans Sarah had drawn on that napkin all those years ago. But this time, there were small changes. The porch was a little wider, to fit more chairs. The windows were bigger, to let in more light, and hammered into one of the new porch posts, right where everyone could see it, was a single bent nail. During the rebuilding, Ethan's son had been helping me and had bent it just like Sarah had. I left it there as a reminder that sometimes the things that look broken can become the strongest parts of the foundation. The board also made one last change. With some of the settlement money, they started a small scholarship fund for local kids going to trade school, carpenters, electricians, builders. They named it the Sarah Hayden Memorial Scholarship. 6 months after Merrill Cartwright was led away in handcuffs, I was sitting on the new dock with my grandson Leo. Our fishing lines were dangling in the still water, catching the last rays of the afternoon Sunday. The new cabin stood behind us, smelling of fresh pine and possibility. Leo had just learned to cast by himself, and he was full of pride. He didn't say much about what had happened. He didn't have to. He just seemed happy to be back. As we sat there in the quiet, watching the water, I thought about everything that had been lost, and everything that had been found. Merrill had taken something precious from me, something I could never get back. But in the end, her act of destruction had led to an unexpected creation. She'd tried to erase my home, to isolate me, to make me powerless. All she did was show me that my real home wasn't just a building made of wood and nails. It was the people who were willing to show up with a hammer and help you build it back up again. They thought they took my home. All they did was give me back my purpose.